Okay, good day. This is the second installment of our cardiovascular lecture. First, we talked about exercise 30 for the blood. If you haven't seen that, kindly check the channel in order for you to be able to listen and absorb the information found in that discussion. And for this second one, we'll be talking about now specifically the structure of the heart. Of course, the heart is the center of the cardiovascular system together with the blood vessels and the blood. If you're ready, let us start. So the heart is actually a four-chambered hollow organ. The way I explain it to my patients whenever I encounter a patient with a heart problem is I make them imagine a house. And this house has two rooms on the top floor and two rooms at the bottom floor, making the house a four-roomed house. And that is how I make them understand the heart as well. So for now, let's stop with that first. Imagine a house with two rooms on top and two rooms at the bottom. So the heart's function is to supply blood, and not just blood but also oxygen to the rest of the body. And we mentioned earlier that oxygen is actually attached to your hemoglobin, which is a vital part of your erythrocytes or red blood cells. Okay? So in order to ensure that blood is supplied to the most distal parts of the body, the heart has to have enough contracting or pumping power to make sure that blood is flown throughout the entire body and reaches the far-flung areas of our body. Okay? The heart's location is also very specific. It's located in the mediastinum, which is the central cavity found in the entire thoracic cavity. And what's unique about the heart is that it is surrounded by a sac called pericardium. Peri means outer. So it's an outer covering of the cardiac muscle or the cardium. That's why the name pericardium. And it forms its own cavity called cavity with a fluid called pericardial fluid. Um, Very important yung location ng heart, no? Because as medical technologists, when you go to your third year, you will find out in your AUBF or analysis of urine and body fluids that pericardial fluid is one of those specimen which you need to know how to extract and also perform tests on the fluid. So this is somehow already a preparation for your third year. Okay? So let's start with that, the pericardium. So we said that the pericardium is a sac, an outer sac which covers the heart, and it actually is composed of two main layers. First is the outer covering of the heart called the fibrous pericardium. This is the one that you see when you take out a heart, no? And the inner layer is called serous pericardium. It is the inner layer and is actually composed of two layers pa. Okay? So, in this image, can you just imagine the outer one is the fibrous pericardium, the inner one is your serous pericardium, and that serous part is composed of two parts pa. The outer layer of the serous pericardium, which is connected to your fibrous pericardium, is called parietal pericardium. Again, parietal pericardium is the outer part of the serous pericardium, which lines or is continuous with the fibrous pericardium, while the visceral pericardium is the part of the serous pericardium that is attached to the heart itself. It is the part that covers the heart and is also known as epicardium. Okay? So, in order for you to better understand, I'd just like to make another um, analysis no, for a while. There you go. So let's imagine this notebook. The outer cover of this notebook is the fibrous pericardium. Okay? And when we open it, you will see the heart. So this outer one is the fibrous, while this inner one is your serous pericardium. I'm sorry for the trash, no? The serous pericardium. The part of that which is attached to your outer is the parietal pericardium, okay? The one that attaches this part to this part. And this part inside, which touches the heart, is your visceral pericardium. So that's a very simple illustration, but hopefully you were able to somehow better understand the pericardium, okay? So lastly, we have a space in the middle of the parietal and the visceral pericardium. And we call that potential space the pericardial cavity. So it is within the pericardial cavity that the pericardial fluid is found. Okay? So it is between the parietal and visceral pericardium. And again, it's very important that you know where the pericardial fluid is, because if you insert a needle and it just happens to be too deep, you might puncture the heart. And if you insert a needle and you're just too shallow, then you won't be able to reach the pericardial fluid. And the effort and the pain of the patient will be to no avail. So sayang. Next, we are going to be talking about the walls of the heart. If you did not notice, the visceral pericardium is the outermost layer of the heart, no? It's also called epicardium. So when we go to the walls of the heart, actually that is the first one that we'll see, the epicardium. It is composed of the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. In this image, it is this thin outer layer here. All right. The next layer is the thickest one. It is the muscular middle layer composed of your cardiac muscles, and we call that the myocardium. And lastly, we have the endocardium, which is again another thin inner layer that covers the valves and the trabeculae, which you will encounter later on. Now, in studying the surface anatomy, first I want you to be oriented with the different rooms as mentioned earlier. So I told you earlier to imagine a house with two rooms on the top floor and two rooms at the bottom floor. The two top floors are called, the two rooms at the top floor, rather, is called atrium. Okay? Atrium. And there is a room to the left and a room to the right, which makes the atrium labeled as the left and the right atrium. So that's the first that I will mention. So in this image, when we look at it anteriorly, you'll only be able to appreciate the right atrium because the left atrium is better appreciated on a posterior view. Okay? So the right atrium is what we see in this image, and this receives blood from your superior vena cava. The right atrium receives blood from your superior vena cava. So what's unique about the atrium is that they are reservoir or collecting chambers of blood. So it is the left and the right atrium that receives blood. Okay, all the time. They are the one that receives blood. But the type of blood they receive are different from each other. So the right atrium, the blood comes from your superior vena cava. Okay? Next are the auricles. The auricles are this small outpouching that you see here at the edges. So they are actually extra space. They are flap-like outpouchings of the left and right atria. So in cases where there's too much blood coming in the heart and the atriums cannot accommodate the blood, they are brought to the auricle. They are just extra space to allow the atrium to have an extra space, no, to accommodate the blood. So those are your auricle. The two rooms at the bottom of the house, so the two top rooms are the left and the right atria, and the two rooms at the bottom are called ventricles, no? Your left and your right ventricles. If the atrium are the receiving chambers of blood, the ventricles are the pumping chambers of the heart, meaning they pump in order to deliver blood to the different areas of the body. Okay? So in this image, we appreciate the right ventricle, which is the most anterior, no? As you can see in this image, it is the one that we really appreciate well because you see its entire surface very well. The right ventricle, the most anterior part. While the left ventricle is the most inferior. Look at the bottom part, no? The bottom part is called apex. And most of the apex is composed of your left ventricle. These two ventricles are separated on the surface by a structure called, anterior interventricular sulcus. Anterior interventricular sulcus. So again, a sulcus is a depression, no? So there is a depression in this area marking the division of the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And in that sulcus, in that depression, this is where usually we see the different blood vessels. When we call those blood vessels coronary vessels, okay? Coronary vessels. Those are the ones that supply blood to the heart tissues. And the coronary vessels are the ones which are usually blocked in a heart attack. Okay? Next, I'd love to, before we move on to that, we also have the superior vena cava, this blue structure here. Blue because it receives or it delivers deoxygenated blood. Okay? So, blood coming from the upper half of the body after the body has consumed its oxygen will be brought back to the heart via the superior vena cava. So deoxygenated blood coming from the upper half of the body will be brought back to the heart via the superior vena cava. And from the superior vena cava, it will go to the right atrium. The next one I want to introduce to you is this large red blood vessel here, and this is your aorta. Aorta. The aorta is actually the largest artery of the body. And this is an important vessel because it delivers blood from the heart to the rest of the body. Okay? The aorta is the largest artery and it delivers blood from the heart to the rest of the body. So we see na the difference no of a vein and an artery. A vein delivers blood or brings back blood to the heart. A vein brings back blood to the heart, while an artery delivers blood away. Letter A, aorta, artery away from the heart, no? It brings oxygenated blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. And we also have another blue structure here. It's called the pulmonary trunk. So it's called a trunk because there are different stems pa eventually. So the pulmonary trunk naman is another it's an artery actually, no, I'm sorry. It's an artery that delivers blood away from the heart to go to the lungs so that it can be oxygenated. But more of that later. So anyway, here's the summary. So here is a posterior view of the heart. And now in this image, we'll be able to appreciate some other structures that we were not able to appreciate earlier. So first, let's go to the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries are the branches of the pulmonary trunk. Okay, again, it's an artery. So where is its flow? Away from the heart But instead of going to the rest of the body, the left and the right pulmonary artery will go to the left lung, and the right pulmonary artery will go to the right lung in order for them to be oxygenated. So from the pulmonary trunk, it will go to the pulmonary arteries and then will end up in the lungs. That's where blood will flow. After blood has been oxygenated in the lungs, they need to be brought back to the heart. And what vessels bring back blood to the heart? Your veins. Because veins bring back blood to the heart, right? So you have your left pulmonary vein so that oxygenated blood from your left lung can go to the left pulmonary vein, and your right pulmonary vein will gather oxygenated blood from your right lung and will bring back blood to the left atrium. Kasi again, the atrium are the receiving chambers for blood. Remember? So the atrium are the receiving chambers. So if the right atrium receives blood from the superior vena cava, the left atrium receives blood from your pulmonary veins. Okay? We also see here this circular structure. You have your left atrium. If the right atrium is seen anteriorly, the left atrium is seen posteriorly. In fact, listen to this, the left atrium is the most posterior part of the heart. The left atrium is the most posterior part of the heart. So we mentioned that the right ventricle is the most anterior, the left ventricle is the most inferior, the left atrium is the most posterior, and the right atrium is the most superior. The most superior. Other than receiving blood from your superior vena cava, it also receives blood from the lower half of the body via the inferior vena cava. Okay? So it is the inferior vena cava which gathers deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body and returns it to the heart, specifically to the right atrium. And just like earlier, you also have here a posterior interventricular sulcus. So interventricle, in between the ventricles. Again, you see here your coronary vessels, no? And it separates the left ventricle from the right ventricle. So here is a summary in case you missed out anything. So let's move on. Now we'll go to the internal anatomy. So this is how the heart looks like after it has been sliced to show the interior parts. So first, I would like for you to appreciate the two rooms on top of the house, your right atrium. Sorry. Let me just go back to that slide. There you go. We have the right atrium here, one room on top, the left atrium here, another room on the top floor. You have your right ventricle here, the first room at the bottom floor, and the left ventricle, the second room at the bottom floor. So now you're able to see the image painted earlier. Note, one house with four rooms, the left and the right atrium, and the left and the right ventricle. So the atrium can be distinguished by its thin walls. You can see naman, no? Very thin yung wall niya ng mga atrium. As compared to your ventricles here, very muscular walls, no? Very muscular walls. So let's start with the right atrium first. There you go. The right atrium again receives blood first from the superior vena cava because this gathers blood from the upper half of the body. And secondly, from your inferior vena cava, which gathers blood from the lower half of the body. So the right atrium receives all of that blood. No? And while the left atrium naman receives blood from your pulmonary veins. Yan, here, the pulmonary veins, the right and the left pulmonary veins. Where did the blood from the pulmonary veins come from again? They came from the lungs. They were just oxygenated from the lungs. And that is why the colors are also different. The right atrium receives non-oxygenated or deoxygenated blood, while the left atrium receives oxygenated blood. That's why the color is red. So the ventricles, as mentioned, are surrounded by a very muscular layer, and that very muscular layer is given there in purpose to allow pumping power, no? To give the ventricles pumping power. So in order to push blood to the lungs or to the entire circulation. So if you noticed, the walls of the left ventricle is thicker compared to the right. And why is that? Because the walls of the left ventricle need more pumping power to push blood to be supplied to the entire body. Okay? So it should be able to reach your fingertips down to the smallest vessel you have in your body. So it needs to have a big muscle layer. So one thing we've noticed here for the right ventricle is that it receives blood from your right atrium. So from the right atrium, blood will flow to the right ventricle. Same goes with the left ventricle. Blood from the left atrium will go to the left ventricle. And what separates these two ventricles in the interior anatomy is the interventricular septum, this middle muscle layer. So in the surface, what separates them is the interventricular sulci or sulcus, but inside what separates them are the interventricular septum. So here is a summary in order for you to remember all those things that we discussed. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so here is a video in order for you to better understand the lecture. Okay, so apparently the video does not have an audio. So I'll just share the link of the video or the video itself via Google Drive. But it's just a simple dissection video, no? In order for you to better understand. Well, anyway, let's go on to this one. The heart valves. So of course, in order for blood to be able to access the four rooms mentioned, namely the right atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle, there should be doors which open and close to allow the entry and exit of blood. And we call these doors heart valves, okay? So heart valves are structures that prevent the backflow and ensures the unidirectional flow of blood in the heart. Meaning, once blood has traveled from one room to another, they cannot go back to the previous room anymore because there is a unidirectional flow of blood in the heart. So there are two types of heart valves actually. The first type is called atrioventricular valve or AV valve. Okay? Atrioventricular meaning they are positioned or located in between an atrium and a ventricle. Okay? So the first example of our AV valve is your tricuspid valve, which is located in between your right atrium and your right ventricle. In fact, others would name the tricuspid valve as the right AV valve. Okay? So blood from the right atrium will only be able to enter the right ventricle once the tricuspid valve opens up. And once inside the right ventricle, they could no longer backflow to the right atrium because the tricuspid valve prevents blood from backflowing. Now, why is it called tricuspid? Because when you look at it from the top view in this image here, you would appreciate three balloon-like structures which opens and closes upon will or upon contraction of the heart. So there are three cusps making the tricuspid valve a tricuspid valve. All right. Next is the bicuspid or mitral valve. The bicuspid valve is found in between the left atrium and the left ventricle. It's also called, or better called, a mitral valve because it looks like the mitre's hat of a bishop. You can just read that up from your Seeleys. But unlike your tricuspid, it only has two cusps, thus the name bicuspid. Similarly, once blood exits the left atrium and goes to the left ventricle, it can no longer go back to the left atrium. All right? And if you notice, the cusps are attached to the myocardium via these string-like structures, and lay people would call them heartstrings, but for medical people like us, we call them chordae tendineae. So chordae tendineae are this thin, strong connective tissue which connects the cusps to the myocardium. And the part of the myocardium where the chordae tendineae are attached to are called the papillary muscles. These are finger-like projections, as you can see here, no? Finger-like projections of the myocardium holding the chordae in place. The second type of heart valve from the other than the atrioventricular valve is your semilunar valve. Okay? The semilunar valve naman is located between a ventricle and a great artery or a great vessel. So, the first type is the pulmonary semilunar valve. It's found in between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Here, the pulmonary trunk. So, once the right ventricle contracts, it will push blood upwards and it will force open the pulmonary semilunar valve to allow blood to travel to the pulmonary trunk and then to its branches, namely the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery, away from the heart pag artery. And where will it go? Through the lungs to be oxygenated. Okay? Once it is oxygenated, it will go back to the left atrium via the left and right pulmonary veins. So, blood will find its way to the left atrium and then the left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle, it will have to open the aortic semilunar valve. So, once this thicker-walled left ventricle will contract, a big amount of blood will be pushed upwards and will force open the aortic semilunar valve and will allow blood to be distributed to the rest of the body. Now, why are they called semilunar valves? It's because their cusps appear half-moon shaped. So, semilunar. Okay? So, here is a summary. And lastly, I mentioned somehow the flow of the heart in the previous discussions, but now we'll discuss it in detail, no? So let's start with blood coming from the upper half of the body. So the oxygenated blood coming from the upper half of the body will enter the superior vena cava. Okay, the superior vena cava. While the oxygenated blood from the lower half of the body will enter the inferior vena cava. And both of them will end up in the right atrium because the right atrium is a collecting chamber together with the left atrium, right? But the oxygenated blood will first go to the right atrium. It will then force open the tricuspid valve and will enter the right ventricle. Okay, are you following? You just have to follow this diagram here. Will enter the right ventricle. Once the left ventricle contracts, it will push the blood upwards to force open the pulmonary semilunar valve and will enter the pulmonary trunk and will divide into the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery and will end up in the lungs for it to be oxygenated. Once oxygenated, blood will go back to the heart via the right and the left pulmonary veins and will enter the left atrium because the left atrium is again a collecting chamber of blood. Once in the left atrium, it will force open the bicuspid or the mitral valve and will end up in the left ventricle. Once in the left ventricle, it will contract and force open the aortic semilunar valve and the blood will enter the aorta in order for it to be distributed to the rest of the body. So that is your blood flow. And as a closing, the lab reports you need to submit are the following. Okay? So that's it for the heart structure. Hopefully, you were able to understand the discussion. And if not, you can just message me or refer to Seeley's for more information. Thank you.